So a great pleasure to be speaking at this meeting, and very exciting to see the bioscience catalyst beginning to come to life. And I think this whole topic, and I think Claire laid that out very clearly, is crucially important, I believe, for business and for science. And I think a particular opportunity for the UK, if we get it right, to build on what is a fundamental strength, I think, of the UK economy and the UK science base. So I'll declare a very clear prejudice. I'm totally believer in openness in science being a fundamental part of how science progresses, and for business, I think it's important for how business progresses, and crucially, those two things need to link together. And to take what Claire was saying, I think the choice in many ways facing many of us is, do you want to own 100% of something that's diminishing and disappearing, or would you rather own a proportion of something that's growing? And I think that's the attitude we need to take into thinking about open innovation. So this graph will be familiar. We live in an era of unparalleled scientific advance, unparalleled increases in our understanding of human biology and its application to health improvement, and yet an era in which the number of new medicines has stayed flat or decreased, and the cost has increased enormously. And that's the crisis that's been facing the pharmaceutical industry, and one which I think speaks to an inability to take ideas and turn them into something practical, which I believe is because of over-restrictive, inward-looking practices in many sectors, and can be helped by really being much more open. Now, the good news on this is actually, if you look at the end there, in fact, the cost is coming down across industry, and in fact, the productivity is increasing. If you look at what's happening in pipelines now, I think there's a very different prospect over the next few years compared to the last decade in many companies. And I think there is a link, if you look, between those companies which have been most outward-looking in the way they've gone about things and that change. So I think there is a change in trend there, but nonetheless, this, I think, very inward-looking period led to a decline in productivity and pushes towards the need for open innovation. So what I want to do over the next 15 minutes or so is just tell you about some of the things that we've been trying to do in GSK to be much more outward-looking, to pick up on what Claire said, to really drive home this idea that even with 10,500 scientists in R&D at GSK, there's no way we're even going to have 1% of all the good ideas in the world. And so therefore we need to be much better connected, much more outward looking. And that, of course, was also part of why we were so keen to see the Bioscience Catalyst start up, and to try to get in the UK a link, and a much closer link, between what are some of the highest caliber world-class universities in the world, a relative over-representation in the UK of big pharma, and a biotech sector and interaction across sectors, which I think could really benefit all of that. The blockbuster model is unsustainable. In other words, setting out to make a blockbuster and that's your model and that's all you're going to do is clearly not possible, nor is it sensible in terms of an era when science actually spreads itself across different types of diseases and different areas. And this, I think, has meant that companies have to be much more agile about where they go to look for new opportunities and to build it on where science happens to be at a ripe stage in order to do drug discovery. Drugs won't be reimbursed unless they're sufficiently differentiated. The regulatory risks are higher. Pricing reflects innovation. In other words, you've got to be innovative, you've got to have good ideas, you've got to be able to progress them, and R&D spend cannot continue to increase, and in fact is not increasing across industry at the moment, it's decreasing. So these are some of the things that we've set out to do, and I'm not suggesting for a moment we've got the answer. These are just some of the things we've tried, and I want to try and talk you through how some of them have worked and where we think some of them will go. So we've definitely pushed an externalization agenda, and I think that was a point that Claire made, that this is about externalization, and there are many different models. And as she put up a definition of open innovation, I think one can get very hooked up on what we mean by open innovation. And here, just on the right-hand side, I would say this is, on this slide, our most extreme type of openness, which is a very IP-free environment, but I view all of this as a form of open innovation. So we set out a number of years ago to say that discovery has to be much more externalized than it had been in the past. We set out to form a number of partnerships with biotechs across the world, in risk-sharing partnerships, in strategic relationships, in flexible acquisitions, a number of different models to say our discovery engine needed to be drawing on worldwide science and expertise, links and interactions, and that will continue to be our model, and I'll tell you something more about that. So we will do about 50% of our discovery inside and about 50% outside, and of course those two things are merged and very interactive. The second thing was very much bridging the gap between academia and industry, and I spent most of my career in clinical academia, and I have to say there was quite a bridge to build, because I think that there was for many years a view from academia that what industry could do is provide money, and a view from industry that academics could perhaps provide services sometimes when they were expert in certain things, or in fact we're just going to take your money and run with it. And I think that this very close relationship between academia and industry is a crucial part of what we need to do, and I'll give you a number of examples. So one of the things that we did was set up what we called an academic discovery performance unit. The idea was simple. It was to say, let's have a group that would take GSK assets, make them available across academia, and say, is there a group that wants to work with us and develop those assets, so these are clinical phase assets, and come in with a different design, a different approach, not to do it our way and then implement it, but rather to say, how would you take this forward? What would your method be to take this into the clinic and develop this medicine? I think it's been an interesting learning experience. I think it's been a big learning experience from those academics we've interacted with, who I think began to see the difference between asking an interesting question and asking a question which ultimately allows you to make a product. And I think it's been a huge opening up for our people. And I think one of the lessons that this group has told me is that the impact on unleashing great ideas within GSK has been huge. People who thought, well, we had to do it a certain way, suddenly started thinking a different way. So I think that's been an important area. I'll come back to this discovery partnerships with academia in just a minute. The other one that we were involved in over the last few years was Imanova. We had an imaging center at the Hammersmith, which was 100% owned by us, state-of-the-art equipment designed to help us progress our pipeline. It seemed to me and to others that actually that was not necessarily a sensible thing to do, that actually the advances in imaging, the approach to really understanding how to use imaging for drug discovery and development were likely to change very, very rapidly, and it was unlikely that we would be able to stay at the forefront. And so with the MRC and the universities around London, we came up with a plan to say, well, let's form a separate company. That was formed through the MRC and those universities. We donated the facility and the equipment, and that's now an independent imaging company as a consortium, which I think will meet our needs much better, because we now have world-class academics leading the development of imaging technologies that we can access rather than trying to do it all ourselves. We have a variety of risk-sharing models with a number of universities. We've set up new companies with academic founders in an attempt to access areas of science that we perhaps don't know about, that others do, in models to try and increase our breadth. And I will come back to and talk about the very open innovation approach, particularly referencing what we're doing in Tres Cantos. I think the overall approach here has been to get away from the not invented here syndrome in GSK and to realize that we need to be part of a very broad, very open academic and industry collaboration, industry collaboration, and big industry biotech collaboration. To go back to the point about, is everything the same? No, it's not. Some of these are much more limited. They are much more specific. And some of these are very, very open, and therefore I think it has to be scaled depending on what you want to achieve. So if I go through some of these, I've already mentioned we've got our own internal groups for drug discovery set up as integrated groups of clinicians, chemists, biologists, drug metabolism experts focused on specific areas with a very clear mission to deliver value for GSK and a budget they can spend inside GSK, outside GSK, whatever they want, because their mission is to develop new medicines, discover new medicines, not to spend the money on fixed internal headcount. So we have our internal units, and we have an equal number, in fact a higher number, of external collaboration. So this is our 50-50 split across discovery. That, I think, is what we would continue. Many people say, well, why don't you go to a totally virtual model of really reducing internal spend and doing everything externally? Personally, I think that's a route to end up not knowing what you're doing. And I think you need to really understand the business in order to be able to run these networks, and you also need to be part of that community in order to benefit from it. One of the changes we made was to say these groups should publish their work in high-quality journals. Publication, of course, is not our primary business. Our primary business is making medicines. But by publishing the work, we've had a number of beneficial effects which you would expect. One, you get your science peer-reviewed, and what you think is fantastic turns out not to be so fantastic when other people look at it sometimes. Two, you become part of the scientific community in a way of equals, and therefore you have a dialogue which is on a different basis from if you are totally inward-looking in what you do. And three, bright, smart, enthusiastic, passionate, challenging young people read the journals and they go and work in places where they see great science happening. So there are a number of reasons to be outward-looking in the way we think about projecting our science. We have a number of public-private partnerships. I won't go through these. Some of them have been successful, some of them have not. I think one of the things that I think about in terms of public-private partnerships is really understanding the lifespan of that partnership. In other words, it doesn't have to be forever. It needs to have some mission which you can achieve in this way and this way only. And Claire's already alluded to an increasing number of industry partnerships, of which Transcelerate is one, 10 big pharmaceutical companies coming together to do certain aspects of clinical trial operationalization together rather than separately. I do want to spend a word talking about discovery partnerships in academia. And this, I think, evolved as we started really thinking about what we wanted from open innovation. And the premise was to say, what do we do well? And I think what we know how to do well is to fundamentally make the medicine. We know how to make something that can be a medicine that can come out to millions of patients. What I think we don't do well is deep exploratory biology and clinical science over many years. That's not what we do. We tend to move into areas as we need to move into them. What I think academia does well in this case is concentrate on an area of biology for many, many years, become deeply expert in different aspects of it, and of course very often have the clinical links to understand what is the clinical experiment you would do. So we set up a system to try to play to those strengths. Now, one option for an academic who wishes to develop their idea into a medicine is to set up a biotech, and of course we welcome and encourage that. But that's not for everyone. The other option for an academic is never to do that and just to publish their papers and have nothing at all to do with industry, and that of course happens a lot, and that's also fine because a lot of academia is about improving knowledge generally. There is, however, I think, a large group who would like to do something and make a medicine but don't quite know how to fit into the system and do not want to give up what they see as their day job, which is being in academia. And it's that group that we've tried to pick, people who wanted to make a medicine, had a good idea, and we said, well, you know the biology, you know the clinical side, we know how to make the medicine. We put senior drug discoverers from GSK together with them. It forms, if you like, a virtual biotech. They get the keys to GSK, so they can access the screening, they can access the facilities, they can access the expertise we have, and it becomes a milestone-driven approach, open in terms of publication, open in terms of the fact that if we pull out, everything goes back to the academic and they can do something else with it. It's a way of us accessing great science and a way of them accessing the ability to turn that great science into medicines. We're going to do about 10 of these worldwide. It's rather overly invested in the UK at the moment because it started here. We need to look more broadly. But I think you'll see that there are a number of great things going on that we can deliver on, and this model, I think, will increase. The most open of what we're doing, I think, is in Tres Cantos, where We did a screen across malaria parasites, and this is a screen in red blood cells looking for death of malaria parasites, and we screened our entire compound collection, and we came up with something like 13,000 hits of things that killed malaria parasites and didn't look toxic, at least at a reasonable concentration. When we saw those results, the question was, what do you do with that? Because you can't possibly pursue 13,500 compounds, and I'm not sure that we'd necessarily be the greatest group to understand which ones to go for, because this is a black box screen. So what we said was, well, why not put all of those compounds in the public domain, put all of the information out there, and see if we can stimulate others to start working on this. There was an interesting reaction from the lawyers when this was first proposed. We were going to throw away all sorts of value. I argued that was not the case, that actually we would create value by doing this. And we did put these out there in the public domain. They're there for anyone to access. They are hosted through the European Bioinformatics Institute. And the idea was, the hope was, that perhaps, and we grouped them so that people could understand what we thought they might do in groups, which were kinase inhibitors traditionally from what we already knew, which had other properties. What we hoped was that somebody who might be interested in cheminformatics would come in and group these differently. What we hoped was that somebody who'd always worked on kinases in malaria would pick some of the kinase inhibitors and test and see, do they actually hit their targets? What we hoped was that this would stimulate them putting their work back in the public domain, and we could build up a worldwide effort to try and crack one of the toughest problems of drug discovery, and of course one of the major unmet needs for society, medicines that can really help treat malaria. It was an act of faith, and actually nothing much happened after we first did it. But a year on, stuff started happening. And now, I heard the other day, 70 groups around the world are using this, and they're putting their information back in the public domain, and we've benefited. We have groups now visiting what we call our open lab in Tres Cantos. We set up a charitable foundation, so some of the laboratory space is not really GSK, it's owned by a charitable foundation that allows academics to come in and out and do their work. Our only rule is they come in, they work with us, they make it public. The result is we're much further down the line now of trying to make a medicine for malaria than we were before. We've got much more exciting targets to go after, we've got more exciting chemistry, we've got more exciting opportunities, and I think others have too. If you like, the substrate for being able to invent has improved. The ability to actually apply the knowledge towards something practical has improved as a result of this. And I think it's going to be a successful experiment. I think the challenge for us is, if this is a successful experiment, if as a result of this we or others make a medicine for malaria that couldn't have been made before, I think the right societal challenge back would be, well, if you can do it for malaria, why can't you do it for diabetes? If you can do it for malaria, why can't you do it for Alzheimer's? And so I think there's a very interesting business model question that follows on from this as to how you run a big company and an interactive company like this in a way that makes business sense once you begin to understand how you can use open innovation to drive the very end product you need to drive, the new innovative medicine. So I've talked about the Open Lab. We put more money into that. It was interesting, when I asked for money to put into it, we got some money from central corporate to put into it. Andrew Whitty's just agreed we'll put more in that because you can see how this is working. We've done the same for the TB situation as we did for malaria, so we're beginning to expand that. Another area which we announced recently was opening up all of our clinical trials data. So in other words, allowing people to actually dig into the raw data on clinical trials. I believe that this is essential. Again, it's one where as soon as you do it, everyone says you've just thrown away the crown jewels, it's a real problem. I don't believe that. I believe that in a society that demands to know what the evidence is on which we're all taking our medicines, or we're prescribing our medicines, or we're giving our medicines to others, if you can't repeat the experiment, I question whether that's science. And if you can't repeat the experiment, then you must at least be able to reanalyze it in a different way. And I think that's the nature of what we're trying to do there. And I believe it will not only benefit trust, which is another angle of this, but I think it will also ultimately lead to greater innovation because people will see things that we hadn't seen. Some of those will be good, some of those will be bad. So it has to be done in a way where you recognize quality, and I think that's a challenge for this type of open innovation. How do you stop it becoming a non-pre-specified analysis that just throws up junk? How do you stop that becoming a public health issue? But I think if it's done correctly, what it will do is stimulate new ideas, new thoughts, and new approaches. So there's a lot going on. I think there are many universities, many academic institutions, many big companies getting involved in this. I do think it is just going to happen. So you can sit on the sidelines and say, I wonder if that's going to work, or you can jump in and be part of it. I don't think it's the same everywhere. Very clear that we are going to protect a lot of what we do. No question about that. IP is critical for a number of things we do, and that will remain so. But I think I've tried to illustrate how, in some areas, we know that we need to be much more outward-looking and much less concerned about protection. I'll say one other thing about academic partnerships, the DPAC model. Our biggest challenge has been the overprotection of IP in the university sector. So we've moved to a very interesting situation where actually the protection of IP in universities has become more restrictive than we think is appropriate for business. Not everywhere, but I think that's a challenge which may be worth discussing during the day. So I never thought I'd give a quote from George Osborne, but I'm going to. So he said last week, you get innovation when great universities, leading-edge science, world-class companies, and entrepreneurial startups come together. Where they cluster, and I do believe that's a critical point for the UK, cluster together, you get some of the most exciting places on the planet. This is where you find the creative ferment which drives modern dynamic economy. Totally agree. So with that note, I shall finish and take questions. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. That's why people want to work for GSK. Right, questions? Yeah. Let's get right up the next one. Yes, on.
Hi, Wenpan Lee from the SGC. A lot of innovation is done within academia, and my question is, when is the best time for the farmers to come in? Because there's still a lot of risk right after some of this innovation. I was wondering whether there's any mechanism to stimulate the creation of new startups, for instance, to bridge this gap between the new data coming out, but that the universities cannot take forward, and the complete take up by the pharmaceutical company. So this middle bridge here, how to stimulate new biotechs to the risk is further for all of us.
Yeah. No. Well. First of all, I think the way you frame the question to some extent implies part of the old model, which is the pharma model is to come in when something is ready and take it and disappear. And I absolutely don't think that's how we should work. But I think you raise an important point. And if I take an example of a company that we established called Tempero, which is based on Th17 biology and tissue-specific Tregs. The whole idea was that. We'll see whether it works out. But the idea was there were groups in academia, in Harvard, that had some work that we thought could become a company. We were very interested in it. It was much too early for us to understand how to use it ourselves, but we thought that we could develop a company, create some value there. The academics get some skin in the game and get some equity in that. And it'll either succeed or it won't. It's actually relatively low cost for us to do it that way, and it opens up the range of possibilities. So I think we will see more of that. I also see that corporate venture funds are likely to be good places to try and stimulate that gap between basic discovery and turning it into something tangible. And this comes back to the point about IP and tech transfer offices. I think the overvaluing of the initial idea is problematic.
Please.
Alex Driver from Keynote. Really just a question on your last slide I'm quite curious about, because you spoke a lot about the GSK efforts in open innovation and all the partners that you have. And here's a quote from for a politician, should open innovation be something that really just comes out of the private domain, or does it need to rely on some help from government funding as well?
Well, I think it does require some government push, actually. I think it requires some, I think there's, particularly in the UK, I think there's a need for a continued look at what the tax incentives are, particularly for small companies. I think the gap we've got are often around small companies that can grow. We need to work on that. I think the universities need, how shall I put it, encouragement in order to be able to do this in the right way, because not all the systems of funding in universities push them towards this. It may push them towards other directions, so I think we need to look at that. And I think things like infrastructure become important for clustering. So, you know, if the government spreads innovation of startup areas and so on widely across the UK and decides that, you know, one MP's constituency somewhere that happens to have one university is the place to invest, I think it's problematic. I mean, we are small and we actually have got concentrations of excellence. Let's use that and try and grow something. I think there then will be a halo effect in other places. So I think there is a role for government in this.
Alan?
Patrick, Alan Baxter, via Sans
An old
Catalyst.
friend.
Quick question. You mentioned a number of obstacles that you had to overcome the way, and you mentioned how, in fact, the opponents, if I can call them that, of open innovation, are appearing from unusual places. In my experience over the last couple of years, some of the biggest opponents of open innovation, the exploitation of it, are not the lawyers who get bad press. It's actually the VCs. Is it important to change the minds of VCs and drag them along with us? Or is it important just to say, okay, VCs will fund single, strong IP, exclusivity-based companies and look for funding for this elsewhere?
Great thing about blaming the VCs, it can either be the vice chancellors or the venture capitalists, and you can blame the lot of them. But I think Alan, I mean, I think you're right. Lots of companies will work in the way you've said, but I think they're the ones who aren't on the right part of the curve, actually. I mean, obviously they might be for a short-term return, but there are many VCs that are changing, I think, and there are certainly some in Boston that you'll know well, where I think they are taking a rather different approach to how they look at the open innovation space. And again, I think in that model, what they're asking is, can we own part of something rather than all of nothing? And so I think there will be different models. I'm not expert enough in the VC world to tell you that one's wrong and one's right, but I do see an emergence of a new type of VC. Now, whether we've got that in the UK, I think is a great question. Definitely, I can see it emerging in Boston.
The people at the back, there's a whole row here, so those who've got stuck in the fog, please don't be shy in coming down and sitting down the front here. There's a question here.
Actually related to Alan's question, I'm very interested in the work that you've been doing at Tres Cantos, and you alluded to the need for new business models. I was wondering if you're able to expand on this really interesting point of what kind of business models you might be envisaging.
Well, I'll tell you what I would like to do there. I mean, first of all, we need to know that experiment's working. I believe now there's enough there to tell us it is. When you've got 70 groups from around the world working on it, it looks like it does work. But of course, it only really works when you make a medicine. If it just turns out to be an enhancement of academia, well, that may not be what people want to do. So we need to see. I believe they'll make a medicine. My approach to this actually is to get that together, and we're doing this as a case study and throw it out to some business schools and say, what would happen if that's what the industry started to look like? What is the business model we should be thinking about to make money from that sort of approach? So I don't have the answer to that, but in a way we're going to do an open innovation crowdsourcing of business schools to say, you know, can they come up with clever models that would allow us to think about how that would work?
Last question, because we're already running over time. Crap chairmanship.
Quick one. Omer Kasher, Imica, based next door, formerly of Imanova. You mentioned Transcelerate, and it was also mentioned in Claire's talk. I find that quite interesting because I never saw Transcelerate as an open innovation activity, but I'm happy to be proven wrong here. So I
Right.
guess my question quite simply is, can you open innovation ecosystem to which the membership of Transallerate are linked, be leveraged in ways that can add real value to it?
So Transallerate has only just started. It's a way of saying, I mean, a basic idea is when we look across the globe at where we do clinical trials, if you go into an investigator, you'll find they've got 10 computers open because they've got 10 different portals for all the companies they're working with. They'll have an audit from GSK on Monday, Lilly on Wednesday, Pfizer on Friday, all asking the same questions and checking the same things. You'll have training of monitors and things, which is exactly the same across the companies. It was to say, let's do it one way and try and harmonise this. It's not a competitive advantage for us. It actually is important to reduce the cost and simplify. The membership at the moment is 10 big companies. The idea is it'll open up. So is it totally open? No. Is it towards the open side? I think it is in the broader definition.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there because we're running a little bit behind time. So round of applause for Patrick, please. Thank you.